The first conflict that started the new period was the Greek Civil War. It was a conflict between communist rebels and the Greek government. The USSR and Yugoslavia, that was a communist country, supported the communist insurgents, and the United Kingdom supported the government army. Finally, the war was won by the Greek pro-government troops when the United States sent financial and military aid. Another conflict was the Berlin blockade. Do you remember when the Second World War was over that Germany was divided into 4 different areas, each one controlled by one of the winners of the war. One controlled by France, another one by the United Kingdom, by the United States, and by the Soviet Union. It was decided by Truman, Churchill, and Stalin in the Potsdam Conference. So, Germany was distributed among France, Britain, United States, and the USSR. And the capital city, Berlin, although it was located in the Soviet area, was also occupied by the 4 allies. These conferences were meetings where something was decided: the creation of a West German single economic area. So France, Britain, and the United States agreed to combine their German administration areas into only one. Stalin, of course, considered this decision as a threat by the capitalist world. So he blocked transports to Berlin. Although the blockade affected land and water transport, the United States Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, and the Royal Australian Air Force kept the communications and air transport with West Berlin. For 15 months, this airlift was working, until Stalin realized that the blockade was very unpopular, so he decided to stop it. So in May 1949, almost 1 year after the blockade started, it was lifted. That year of 1949, the agreements made at Potsdam Conference were over. The Western Allies supported the creation of a new Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, under the influence of the Western Bloc and under a capitalist economic system and a democratic political system. So the USSR supported the creation of a new East Germany country. It was created the German Democratic Republic, and this country joined the satellite states under the USSR area of influence. A different kind of conflict happened in Germany, specifically in Berlin. Remember that Berlin was divided into 4 administrative areas, and later the French, United States, and United Kingdom areas were put together into only one. So Berlin actually was divided into 2 zones: the Western zone, the capitalist zone, capitalist Berlin, and the Eastern, the communist Berlin, the capital city of the Democratic Republic of Germany. Since that moment, West Berlin started developing economically much better than East Berlin, and that meant that a lot of people from East Berlin emigrated to West Berlin, and from West Berlin to West Germany. By 1961, the amount of people who left East Germany was so huge that the Soviet authorities stopped this mass migration, building a wall to prevent people crossing from one side to the other one. This wall divided and separated both Berlins for 28 years. The Eastern Guards received shoot-to-kill orders to prevent people from escaping East Berlin. Around 200 people were killed trying to reach the west side of the city. But 5,000 Berliners successfully defected and arrived to West Berlin and to West Germany. Actually, the first conflict we should have studied should be the Chinese Civil War, because this conflict started before the Second World War. It was interrupted during the war, and after the war, it resumed. It started in 1927 and ended in 1949. In this conflict, the Chinese Nationalist Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek, fought against the Chinese Communist Party. Communists won, and the leader, Mao Zedong, proclaimed the People's Republic of China. And losers of the war took shelter in the island of Formosa and established there the Republic of China, better known as Taiwan. The conversion of China into a communist country was considered a triumph by the Soviet Union. 1 year later, the USSR and China signed a treaty, the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship. It was an agreement of mutual aid. Anyway, China and the USSR will have a difficult relationship, because although both of them are communist countries, they were really different. As you know, nowadays there are two Koreas. North Korea, its official name is Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and South Korea, its official name is Republic of Korea. Korea existed in the past as a single country. That finished with the Japanese occupation in 1910. Since that moment, Korea was just a part of the Japanese Empire until the end of the Second World War. When the Second World War was over, the Soviet armies occupied the north of Korea. And the United States, the country was divided into two different regions at the 38th parallel. North parallel, of course, because Korea is on the northern hemisphere. These countries were supported by the two superpowers. The USSR supported the communist regime on the North Korea, and United States supported a dictatorial regime in South Korea. The conflict started in 1950, when North Korea invaded almost all South Korea. The United Nations condemned the invasion because it was considered illegal, and sent a United Nations peacekeeping forces to end the conflict under the leadership of the United States. The United States armies reconquered the territory and went on invading North Korea, coming closer and closer to the Chinese border. And that was considered as a threat by China, and an illegal action. Same way the invasion of South Korea was considered illegal by the United Nations, the invasion of North Korea should be illegal too. So Chinese army joined the war and conquered all North Korea and the north of South Korea. So the international tension grew, and that was the first time after the Second World War when the use of atomic bombs was considered. Actually, one American general, General MacArthur, who was the chief in command of the Pacific War during the Second World War, he asked permission to use atomic bombs against China. Finally, it was signed an armistice between North and South Korea. According to this armistice, the demilitarized zone would be created to separate both Korea's borders. The United Nations would be the organism to control the area. Do you remember when we studied the First World War? The end of the war was after an armistice was agreed. This armistice was signed at 11 o'clock, the 11th day, 11th month, 1999. After this armistice, there was a series of treaties. So the armistice was to stop fighting, but the end of the war was actually when countries made agreements and they signed peace treaties. Versailles, Sèvres. So between North and South Korea happened exactly the same. There was an armistice to stop fighting, but the problem is the peace treaty never was signed. That means nowadays, today, between North and South Korea, they are officially still at war because they never signed the peace treaty. They just signed an armistice. They stopped fighting. In the Caribbean, there was a conflict, and that one was the closest moment we were to a full-scale atomic war. Everything happened in Cuba, where the revolutionary Fidel Castro was the prime minister, after his guerrilla movement ended the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista in 1958. But the conflict started in 1961, when the United States Intelligence Agency supported an invasion of Cuba by a group of anti-Castro Cuban exiles. This invasion, known as Battle of Bay of Pigs, was a fail. But Fidel Castro feared future invasions by the United States, so he established closer ties with the USSR, proclaiming his country as a communist one. And 1 year later, in 1962, the United States deployed nuclear missiles in Turkey, close to the USSR. Of course, the leader of the USSR, Nikita Khrushchev, considered this act as a threat and responded placing nuclear missiles in Cuba. You placed missiles close to the Soviet Union, I placed missiles close to the United States. When a United States spy plane found out the missile facilities in Cuba, the President of the United States John Fitzgerald Kennedy, established a naval blockade on October 22nd to prevent further missiles from reaching Cuba. The United States announced it would not permit offensive weapons to be delivered to Cuba, and demanded that the weapons already in Cuba could be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Khrushchev answered that first the United States should dismantle the missiles deployed in Turkey. Tension was at its maximum because Russian boats were approaching Cuba, transporting more missiles, and the United States had the blockade ready to fight against these boats. A confrontation like that would mean the beginning of an atomic war. Because of that, people were terribly scared, especially in the United States. So people left their jobs and they went home to die with their families. So tension was really high. After several days of tense negotiations, an agreement was reached between the United States and the Soviet Union. Publicly, the Soviets would dismantle their offensive weapons in Cuba and return them to the Soviet Union, subjected to a United Nations verification, in exchange for a United States public declaration and agreement to avoid invading Cuba again. The United States agreed that it would dismantle all United States-built Jupiter ballistic missiles which had been deployed in Turkey against the Soviet Union. The most famous conflict of the Cold War was the Vietnam War. The origin of this war was the decolonization process in Indochina. Indochina was a French colony, and after the Second World War, during Potsdam Conference, it was divided, the same way Korea or Germany was. The communist Vietnamese revolutionary Ho Chi Minh tried to create a unified Republic of Vietnam, but French authorities refused, and then a civil war started. North Vietnam became a communist regime, and South Vietnam a dictatorial regime supported by the United States once the French were defeated. Since the withdrawal of the French authorities, the civil war went on between the South Vietnam forces and the North Vietnam guerrilla. It was named the Viet Cong. United States supported the Army of South Vietnam with weapons and supplies from the very beginning. But in 1965, they started sending combat troops. The war lasted for 10 years more, and the United States was unable to defeat the Viet Cong guerrilla. Aerial bombings and the use of chemical and modern weapons were not enough to win the war, and popular opinion in the United States grew against the war. The huge American losses, 58,000 people and 303,000 wounded, plus images of tortures and assassinations committed by the United States soldiers, increased the anti-war movement within the United States. It's the period of time of the hippies. The new president of the United States in 1969, Richard Nixon, realized the United States couldn't win the war, so he started peace talks. Finally, Viet Cong authorities and the United States agreed a ceasefire in 1973, and the United States troops withdrew. Anyway, the United States went on supplying the South Vietnam government to continue the war, but a major offensive in 1975 from the north led to the fall of the South Vietnam capital city, Saigon, and the end of the war. Finally, Vietnam was unified into a single country. It was called the Socialist Republic of Vietnam in 1976. And the United States suffered their first military defeat, and a sentiment of anti-Americanism, this kind of feeling, spread around the world.